Mason Hale bought an abandoned Mafia mansion for $500. No one else dared. But the moment he stepped inside, something felt wrong. Echo, his loyal dog, paced nervously, eyes darting to the shadows. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed from above footsteps, slow and deliberate. Mason froze his breath, catching in his throat. He called to Echo, but she wasn't listening. She barked fiercely at the darkness, warning him of something unseen. Mason stepped deeper into the house, the floorboards groaning beneath him, and then an unexpected sound, a whisper too faint to understand, yet unmistakably clear. Who or what was in the mansion with them? Mason Hale had always been a man of silence, the kind of quiet that settled deep pressing against your ears until it drowned out everything else. The hum of machinery and the crackle of radio chatter from his military days felt like ghosts now fading with each passing year. All that remained was the stillness broken only by the rhythmic sound of his breath. It had been months since he left the city. After his last deployment, Mason had shut down, withdrawn from everything and everyone. His family was gone, his friends too. The past felt like a heavy weight, something he couldn't lift, something that followed him. So when he saw the ad for the mansion $500 for an abandoned Mafia house, he saw it as a chance for escape. The mansion sat alone on the outskirts of town, isolated and forgotten. It was a far cry from the small apartments he had rented over the years, but Mason didn't care. It was just another empty place, and that's what he wanted. Empty. No noise. No faces. No reminders of the life he left behind. Echo, his German shepherd, was the only living thing in his life that didn't feel like a reminder of loss. She had been there when he came back from his last tour, loyal as ever. And that's why when the house called to him, he brought her along. The mansion was cold. It wasn't the drafty kind of cold you'd expect from an old building. It was the kind of cold that pressed against your skin, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Mason walked through the front door, the old wood creaking under his boots, the smell of dust and mildew filling the air. There was no life here, nothing but old memories and fading grandeur. The wallpaper peeled in places, the marble floors cracked, but the place was solid. It had stood the test of time just like Mason. Both had their share of scars. Echo was already uneasy. She paced around the grand foyer, sniffing the air, her tail low eyes darting from one corner of the room to another. Mason watched her, but didn't think much of it at first. Dogs had their instincts, sure, but sometimes they were just dogs. But then the growling started. Low at first, a deep rumble in her chest that vibrated through the floor. Mason's hand paused on the cracked door frame. Echo was staring at the staircase, her ears perked up, hackles raised. Something about the house made her nervous, but Mason couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just the usual strange place. It was a feeling in his gut, something that gnawed at him like the start of a bad memory. He shook it off, turning his attention to the spacious living room ahead. The mansion was too big for just him and Echo. But that was the point. A mansion like this would be his final retreat, a place to breathe, to settle into a life of quiet. The last chapter of his existence with no distractions, no noise. Echo, however, wasn't convinced. She continued to growl, moving cautiously toward the grand staircase that spiraled up to the second floor. The house seemed to groan under its own weight, the creaking wood echoing through the halls, as if it were waking up after a long sleep. Mason stepped forward, ignoring the unease building in his chest. His eyes flicked to Echo and then to the stairs. He called to her, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at the dark staircase as if something or someone was up there waiting. He sighed. "What's wrong with you, girl?" he muttered, though he already knew the answer. The house was unsettling. No one had lived here for decades. The history of this place was enough to make anyone's skin crawl. Mafia dealings, betrayals, the disappearance of its previous owners. And yet all Mason wanted was to turn the page. Start fresh. But something about the house held him back. Something was off, a presence that lingered, a weight in the air that made the silence feel heavier than usual. He could feel it in his bones, the way the walls seemed to press in on him, the way the air felt thick like it was holding a secret. But Mason wasn't one to believe in ghosts or curses or whatever this house was supposed to be haunted by. Echo's growl escalated, breaking him from his thoughts. Her body was rigid, her eyes never leaving the dark staircase. Slowly, almost cautiously, she took a step back, her nose sniffing the air again. She didn't like what she smelled, and that unsettled Mason. He had learned to trust her instincts, even if they didn't always make sense. He walked toward her, placing a hand on her fur, and glanced at the staircase. The soft thud of something footsteps reverberated from above, but there was no one there. His heart skipped a beat. Mason turned his attention back to Echo, who was now pacing near the door. She was unsettled, on edge. The hairs on his neck stood up. There was something in the house with them. Something old, something alive, and he had no idea what it was. Mason stood frozen at the foot of the staircase, the echo of those footsteps still lingering in his ears. His heart was pounding now faster than it had any right to be. He looked down at Echo, who was no longer growling. Instead, she was eerily still, her body tensed, her gaze fixed on the darkened staircase above. She was waiting for something or someone. He swallowed hard, trying to shake off the unease crawling up his spine. "It's nothing," he muttered to himself, stepping forward toward the stairs. His boots creaked louder than he expected, each step an unnatural noise in the thick silence. He called to Echo, but she didn't move. Her eyes never left the top of the stairs, her ears flat against her head. Mason exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the banister. There were no answers here, no immediate danger. It was just an old house full of strange sounds and shifting air. The air had grown heavier since they arrived, colder, like the house was breathing. But it had been abandoned for years. The only thing alive here was Echo. He took another step, then another. The house groaned, the floor creaking beneath him, as if protesting his presence. Echo's sharp, sudden bark startled him. She lunged toward him, grabbing his pant leg with her teeth. "Hey," he snapped, shaking her off. "What is it?" Her eyes were wide now, filled with an intensity he hadn't seen before. She backed away from him, circling the room, eyes darting between the stairs and the windows. She was frantic. Her growl grew louder, more urgent, and then just as suddenly as it had started, she froze again, her tail tucked. Her body low to the ground, she crawled to the corner, staring out into the darkened hallway. Mason moved cautiously toward the stairs, but the feeling in the pit of his stomach was growing heavier, pulling at him. Something wasn't right. Upstairs, the air seemed thicker. The shadows stretched unnaturally, swallowing the small beams of light that tried to cut through the dust-filled air. The old chandelier above had long since lost its brilliance. Now its dimmed light seemed to mock him as he ascended further into the mansion's depths. The staircase creaked under each step as if it were protesting his every movement. He could hear the wind howling outside, rattling the windows, but there was another noise so faint it might have been the house settling. A whisper carried on the wind, or was it the faintest footstep? His pulse quickened. "Get a grip," he told himself. He was just tired. The isolation, the quiet, the long hours spent away from people, from the world. He needed rest. But even as he tried to convince himself, a small voice deep inside knew it was more than that. There was something in this house, something waiting, something that hadn't moved in decades, but now it was stirring. Echo's growl broke the silence again, low and constant. She was now pacing back and forth, fur bristling as if she was sensing something Mason couldn't see. He had seen her act this way before, alert, but more than that, protective. She wasn't afraid of ghosts or shadows. But whatever had her on edge now was different. It wasn't just a wild animal or a sound in the night. No, this felt deliberate. He reached the top of the stairs, and as he stepped into the hallway, the first thing he noticed was the cold. It wasn't the kind of cold that simply came from an old house. It was a deeper cold, a strange, unnatural chill that wrapped itself around his skin and seemed to settle deep in his bones. He shivered, but he refused to acknowledge the feeling. Echo stopped pacing, sitting down in front of the first door on the right. She looked up at him, eyes wide, ears pressed flat. She whined low, her body trembling. "What is it, girl?" Mason asked, his voice barely a whisper now, as if the air itself might respond. He stepped toward the door, reaching for the tarnished knob. The door was locked. Not a surprise, everything in this house was locked up, or so it seemed. Yet for some reason this door felt important. It felt like the last door between him and what he didn't know. But instinct urged him forward. He tried to open it, but the knob wouldn't budge. He turned it again, pressing harder. Echo's body stiffened as the wind outside howled again, shaking the windows. A loud crack sounded from somewhere deep inside the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps again. But this time, they were closer. Much closer. Mason's heart raced. There was someone in the house. His hand trembled as he turned the knob one last time, the rusted metal grinding against his grip. It moved slightly, but not enough to open. His mind raced, his military instincts kicking in. Someone was in here. He knew it now, the hair standing on the back of his neck. But who? And why? A sudden sharp bang echoed from upstairs as if something had just fallen over. Mason's breath caught in his throat. Echo, now at his side, barked once louder, more frantic than ever. It was like the house itself was screaming. He stepped back, pulling Echo with him, as they retreated down the hallway. The door, now open by a fraction, loomed behind them. But it wasn't just the door that called him. It was the whisper. The same whisper that had carried on the wind, that voice he had heard just moments before. Now it was louder, clearer. and it was coming from the room at the end of the hallway. Mason stared at the door, his mind racing. He had come here to escape, but what if the mansion hadn't been waiting for him to hide? What if it had been waiting for him to find something? Mason stood at the foot of the stairs, his mind racing. The whisper had become clearer now, like a soft murmur carried on the wind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong in this house. Echo, usually so confident, was now walking with caution, her head low, her steps soft as she followed him. Her body was tense, and Mason could feel it, a low hum of nervous energy between them. He reached the bottom of the stairs, but the unease in his gut wasn't fading. In fact, it was growing stronger. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but Mason felt it something more than just the house settling. Echo stopped in her tracks, suddenly stiff. Her ears pricked up, her gaze locked on the attic door at the end of the hallway. Mason followed her gaze, a chill creeping down his spine. The attic door was slightly ajar. Mason's breath caught in his throat. Why was the door open? He hadn't touched it. And Echo, she was never this unnerved. She was always the one who gave him comfort, who knew when to act and when to be still. But tonight she was restless. And so was he. "Come on, girl," he muttered, trying to shake off the growing dread. He had to go check it out. It was just an old house full of creaks and groans. But why did everything feel so alive tonight? Echo didn't move. She sat staring at the door, her low growl vibrating through her chest. She wasn't backing down. Mason knew he couldn't ignore her warnings any longer. Something was wrong. But when he moved toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. As he reached for the handle, the whisper grew louder. It wasn't the wind, not this time. It was a voice, a faint voice, almost too quiet to hear, but there. And it was coming from the attic. He turned the handle slowly, the door creaking open with a sound that felt too loud in the stillness. The attic was shrouded in darkness, with only a thin beam of moonlight filtering through a small window, casting long shadows on the dusty floor. Old crates were scattered around their contents, hidden beneath layers of dust and cobwebs. But one crate sitting in the corner was different. Mason's heart skipped a beat as he spotted the markings on it. A name, Rosini. The name hit him like a punch to the stomach. Domenico Rosini, the Mafia boss whose empire had crumbled years ago. The man whose legacy had left this mansion abandoned, forgotten. But now the name was here, written across a crate that seemed oddly out of place. Mason's hand hovered over the crate, his pulse quickening. What was it doing here? Why had it been left hidden for so long? The whisper grew louder, more urgent, as if urging him to open it. And as his fingers touched the lid, a cold draft swept through the room. Echo barked sharply, pulling at his sleeve, but Mason couldn't stop. The mystery was too great. He had to know what was inside. Mason's fingers trembled as they gripped the edge of the crate. The whisper from the attic had turned into a faint but distinct sound, like the wind itself carrying words. He could feel the presence of someone beckoning him to open it. The old wooden lid creaked as he slowly lifted it, the noise too loud in the otherwise still attic. Echo whined again, pulling at his sleeve, but Mason couldn't stop. He wasn't sure why, but he had to know what was inside. It was almost like the mansion itself had claimed him, urging him to unveil its secrets. A rush of cold air brushed against his skin as he lifted the crate's lid fully. Inside, there were old faded papers yellowed with age. Mason's eyes darted over them quickly, but the first thing that caught his attention wasn't the papers. It was a small, leather-bound book lying at the bottom of the crate. Its cover was cracked and worn, but there was no mistaking it. It had a certain weight to it, an almost undeniable pull. He reached for it carefully, the book's surface cool to the touch, and immediately the whispers in the air grew louder, more urgent. He could swear he heard something, a name repeated over and over, but the words were lost in the noise of his own heartbeat. Echo barked again, more sharply this time, her body low to the ground, her hackles raised. Mason froze his hand inches from the book. The dog was unnerved. He could feel it in her, every movement, every tremble in her body. Whatever was in that book, whatever secret it held, was stirring something in both of them. But curiosity, that insatiable need for answers, kept his hand moving. With a quick motion, he pulled the book free from the crate and flipped it open. The pages inside were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. A cold chill settled over him as he scanned the first few words. It was a journal. And it wasn't just any journal, it was Rosini's journal. The name on the first page sent a cold shiver down Mason's spine. Domenico Rosini. Mason's breath hitched. This was it. This was the key to everything, the mystery of the mansion, of why it had been abandoned, of why he was drawn here in the first place. He had heard the stories, the mafia, the violence, the betrayal. The mansion was built on blood, on lies, and the remnants of power long lost. But this journal, it was personal. Rosini's personal account. It was the final chapter of a life that had left only ruins behind. The whispers in the attic were now louder, more defined. Mason could feel them creeping into his mind like they were trying to tell him something important. The journal pages fluttered as if moved by some unseen force stopping at a particular entry. Mason bent closer, his eyes scanning the words, his heart racing as he read. "They will never let me go, but I will leave something behind. A legacy pure and untouched. The trust, the one they tried to erase, it will survive no matter what. Let them believe I am gone, let them think I have vanished, but I will find a way to make it live on." Mason stopped reading for a moment, his breath shallow. The journal spoke of a legacy of something hidden, something valuable, that Rosini had intended to leave behind. This wasn't just about money or power. This was about redemption, about a man trying to leave behind something pure, something that could outlast the chaos of his life. The words lingered in his mind as he flipped through the rest of the journal. Rosini's writing grew more frantic with each page, and Mason could almost feel the man's desperation, his fear that everything he had built would collapse. The journal was filled with plans, names, and dates, but one thing stood out. Rosini had hidden something in the mansion, something that he had hoped would fulfill his final wish. The house creaked again, a sound like it was shifting, groaning under the weight of its history. Echo growled low, her body rigid as she stared at the open attic door. Suddenly, Mason felt a rush of cold air. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if it too was waiting for something to happen. And then, Mason understood. The mansion wasn't just a building. It was part of something bigger. Rosini's secret had never been buried. It had been waiting for someone to uncover it, waiting for him. He slammed the journal, shut his fingers, trembling as he clutched it to his chest. The weight of it, the responsibility of it, felt heavier than he had ever imagined. This was no longer just about him finding a place to hide. The mansion was a key to unlocking something long buried, something that had been waiting for years to be found. Echo barked once more, her voice sharp, cutting through the air. Mason turned toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The mansion wasn't empty. It never had been. It was alive, and it was waiting for him to uncover its truth. The house was silent, save for the soft scraping of Mason's boots against the old wooden floor. The journal was still clutched tightly in his hands, but now it felt heavier. Every page, every word in it seemed to be drawing him deeper into the mansion's mysteries. What had Rosini hidden here, and why had he been so desperate to protect it? The journal spoke of secrets, but they were locked away in riddles and half-sentences, as if Rosini had known someone might come looking for the truth, but he never could have known it would be Mason Hale. He sat down on an old leather armchair, the fabric cracking under his weight, and opened the journal again. The flickering light from the fire cast long shadows across the room, stretching over the walls, as if the house itself was trying to tell him something. Echo sat by the window, her head resting on her paws, but her eyes never left him. She was as uneasy as he was, though neither of them could explain why. All they had were these fragments, words, in a forgotten book, moments that didn't seem to belong to this time. Mason's eyes skimmed over the next entry. "I cannot undo the past, but I can ensure the future. There is a door behind the wall in the basement. Only the worthy should be allowed to enter. They must find it themselves. The legacy of my empire, my mistake, must remain hidden from those who would destroy it. Let them look, let them search, but they will find only dust, and the walls will hold the secret forever." The words chilled him, and a dark feeling settled in his chest. A door behind the wall in the basement. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. Rosini had hidden something in the house, but what Mason couldn't shake the idea that the basement was key, that it was where Rosini's legacy, whatever it was locked away. But there was something else, something deeper in the back of his mind, a feeling that the house itself had more to reveal. It was like it was alive, holding its breath, waiting for Mason to uncover its truth. Echo's ears perked up suddenly, and she let out a low growl, pulling Mason out of his thoughts. He looked up, meeting her gaze. She wasn't reacting to any sound. There was nothing in the room but them, the fire, and the thick silence that had filled the house for years. Mason stood, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to see this door, this hidden place in the basement. The journal had given him his next clue, but it was as if the house was forcing him to take action. For all his efforts to remain disconnected from the world, the past had a way of catching up with you, especially if you lived in a place like this. He couldn't help but wonder what Rosini's past had been, what dark deeds had been done behind closed doors, and why they had to be kept secret. Mason glanced down at the journal again. He hadn't noticed the small sketch in the corner of one of the pages. It was faint, drawn in delicate strokes. He leaned in, squinting at the faded image. A door. The same door. The one behind the wall in the basement. But the drawing wasn't just of the door, it was of a man standing before it, his hands raised. It was Rosini. The figure was unmistakable, but what struck Mason the most was the look on his face. It wasn't one of triumph or fear. It was a look of deep regret. The man in the drawing was begging for forgiveness. For what? The question hung in the air as Mason stared at the page. Whatever Rosini had hidden, it wasn't just treasure or wealth. It was something much darker. Something tied to the man's own actions, his own guilt. The fire crackled the sound like a voice breaking the silence. Mason snapped the journal, shut his mind, racing. Echo stood up, her body tense, and moved toward the door. Without thinking, Mason grabbed the flashlight he had left on the table and hurried out of the room. Echo was already ahead of him, her claws clicking against the floor as she led the way down the hall. He didn't speak to her, he didn't need to. She knew what he was about to do. The dog had always been his silent guide, alerting him to danger when it was too late to ignore it, showing him the way when his instincts failed him. The basement door was cold to the touch when Mason reached it. He turned the handle, the metal groaning as it reluctantly opened. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and dust. The faint smell of rot lingered in the corners of the room. The basement was a long, dark space, lined with shelves of old crates and forgotten memories, just as the rest of the house had been. But something about this place felt different. The floor beneath his feet felt unstable, as if something had been buried beneath the layers of dust and decay. Echo barked once, her voice echoing off the stone walls, and then she darted toward a corner of the room. Mason followed her, his flashlight sweeping across the cluttered space, and then he saw it. In the far corner, almost hidden behind a stack of old wooden crates, there was a faint outline of a door, just as Rosini's journal had described. The door was sealed shut with what appeared to be stone, but time had taken its toll. The edges were cracked and worn. Mason stepped closer, his heart racing. He could feel it now, the weight of the mansion's past pressing down on him. He wasn't just uncovering a hidden room. He was about to open a chapter of history that no one had been meant to read. Mason stood frozen in front of the door, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The faint outline was unmistakable, just as Rosini's journal had described. But now, standing in front of it, Mason could almost feel the weight of the years pressing against him, urging him to act. It wasn't just a door. It was the last thread in a tangled story he had only just begun to understand. Echo sat back on her haunches, staring intently at the stone door. Her growl had faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The dog's posture had shifted from tension to something else, perhaps understanding. She knew just as he did that this was it. This was the key to the mansion's secret. But what would happen once it was opened? Mason's heart pounded in his chest, the quiet surrounding him somehow more deafening than the loudest noise. He ran his hand over the crumbling stone, the texture rough and ancient beneath his fingers. He could feel the coolness of the surface, the deep chill that seemed to radiate from within the wall itself. This wasn't just a door. It was a barrier, one that had been sealed for a reason. Something had been hidden here, something so significant that it had to be kept away from prying eyes for decades. The journal had spoken of the door of Rosini's final wish to protect his legacy from those who would destroy it. But what had Rosini hidden here? Mason couldn't stop thinking about it. The journal's words about a legacy and the worthy kept echoing in his mind. But worthy of what? And how would he, of all people, fit into Rosini's plans? Taking a deep breath, Mason set the flashlight down and stepped back. He needed a better look, something more than just the flashlight's beam. The stone door was old, he could see that now. It had been sealed for so long that the mortar was barely holding the stones together anymore. The edges had started to crumble, worn down by time, but still stubbornly intact. He stepped back again this time, pacing around the room, searching for something, anything that could give him a clue about how to open it. The basement was dark, filled with the smell of mildew and damp earth. But amidst the clutter of old crates and debris, Mason noticed something unusual, a small crack in the stone wall behind one of the crates. It was barely visible, but there was something about it, an irregularity in the stone, that didn't match the rest of the structure. Mason moved toward it, clearing the space around the crate. Echo followed him, standing quietly as he moved the heavy crate aside, revealing the small crack. It was faint, but the edges were perfectly straight, as if someone had intentionally carved it. "Looks like we're not the first to try and open this," Mason muttered to himself. He bent closer, running his fingers over the crack. It wasn't just the surface of the wall that had been chipped away. It was as if something had been hidden beneath it, something he wasn't meant to see. His fingers brushed a small hidden lever, almost imperceptible. He hesitated for a moment, then pressed down on it. The wall groaned as if waking from a long slumber. Slowly, the stones began to shift, pulling apart with a sound that made Mason's skin crawl. The door was moving. A cold draft swept over him, and the faint scent of something old and musty filled the air. The stone door creaked, but it didn't open fully. It stopped just before it could swing wide, leaving a narrow gap. Mason's breath caught in his throat as he peered into the darkness beyond. The light from the flashlight barely pierced the blackness inside the room. What was behind this door? What had Rosini been hiding all these years? Echo, her fur standing on end, let out a low, rumbling growl. It was unlike anything Mason had heard before. The sound wasn't just one of warning. It was a deep, primal sense of something wrong. Mason didn't wait. He reached for the door, his hand shaking slightly as he pushed it open further, revealing what lay beyond. The gap widened enough for him to see the space inside, a small, dark room filled with dust-covered crates and old, forgotten relics. And in the center, illuminated only by the dim light of Mason's flashlight, was something he hadn't expected to see. A large, iron-bound chest. Mason's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The chest had to be it, the legacy that Rosini had hidden. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The door, the journal, the cryptic words about the worthy it all led here. But as he took a step forward, something shifted in the air. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. The chest resting quietly in the center of the room beckoned him forward. Mason reached for it, but before his hand could touch the heavy metal, a sharp sound cut through the silence, the sound of something moving upstairs. It was loud, unmistakable. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone else was here. Mason froze at the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, like someone walking across the creaky floor upstairs. His hand remained on the chest, but the weight of it seemed to shift. The air in the room felt colder, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Echo's low growl intensified, vibrating in the silence, her body tense as she shifted uneasily by his side. He should have been more prepared. He should have noticed the signs, the way the air had changed, the moment he opened the hidden door, the way the house seemed to breathe with him. But the footsteps, those footsteps made his pulse quicken. He wasn't alone. Someone had been here watching him. He wasn't just in the mansion anymore. He was now part of its history. The footsteps grew louder, unmistakable on the wooden floor above. Whoever it was wasn't trying to hide, wasn't creeping around like some thief. It was as though they were aware of him, aware of his presence in the house. The idea made Mason's skin crawl. His heart raced, but his feet remained glued to the floor, unwilling to leave the chest, unwilling to leave the mystery unresolved. He had come this far, and now there was no turning back. "Echo," he whispered, glancing down at his dog, who was still growling, her eyes darting back and forth between him and the attic door. Echo was a soldier trained to detect danger in the field, but this was different. This wasn't some threat she could identify. There was something more here. The room felt alive. Mason moved cautiously toward the stairs, keeping his eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening for the next movement. The footsteps continued slow and deliberate, as if they were circling above him, taunting him. He could feel the weight of whatever was happening in the house, something from the past, something that had been waiting just like him. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he didn't hesitate. He gripped the railing, his knuckles white, and slowly ascended each step, creaking louder than the last. Echo stayed close, her body pressed against his legs, her fur bristling with tension. The footsteps stopped as Mason reached the top of the stairs, the silence now suffocating. He could feel the presence like a shadow looming over him. It wasn't just the house anymore, it was something else. Something that didn't belong. He walked down the hallway, following the faint echo of the footsteps, which seemed to shift with every step he took. The old wood groaned beneath him, creaking like the bones of the house itself, and every flicker of light from his flashlight seemed to cast strange, unsettling shadows along the walls. He stopped outside a door at the end of the hallway. It was just as he had imagined, sealed shut, but not for long. The door looked as if it hadn't been opened in decades, with dust and cobwebs hanging from the edges. But it was different from the other rooms. It felt important. Something drew him to it. His fingers brushed the handle, and the door creaked open with surprising ease. Inside the room was dark, colder than the rest of the house, and the air smelled thick like damp earth. It took a moment for Mason's eyes to adjust, but when they did, his breath caught in his throat. The room was filled with old furniture, faded chairs, cracked mirrors, and bookshelves overflowing with dusty tomes. But at the far end of the room, sitting under a thin layer of dust, was a small wooden desk. On the desk, illuminated by a thin shaft of light from the window, was a stack of old papers. A letter partially unfolded lay on top of the pile. The handwriting was elegant, the ink faded but still legible. Mason approached it cautiously, almost afraid to touch it. It felt wrong, like he was trespassing in a place he wasn't meant to be. He picked up the letter, the paper brittle in his hands, and began to read. "To whoever finds this, I beg you, do not let this house be forgotten. The past cannot be erased, but it can be redeemed. If you are reading this, you have uncovered the truth. You have found the key, but the journey is not yet over. Beware of what you uncover next. The walls hold more than just the weight of history. They hold the sins of men who tried to bury the truth. The letter ended there with no signature, no name, just an ominous warning. Mason's mind raced as the weight of the words settled in. This wasn't just about a man's legacy or hidden treasures. This was something far darker, something that had been kept hidden in the walls of this house for a reason. The house wasn't just a building. It was a tomb of secrets of guilt, of things best left forgotten. Echo barked sharply behind him, snapping Mason out of his trance. She was standing in the doorway, her body tense, as she stared at something he couldn't see. The footsteps. They had started again, only now they weren't coming from above. They were coming from behind him. He spun around his hand, gripping the letter tightly, his breath catching in his throat. The door to the room slammed shut with a deafening crash. Mason's heart pounded in his chest as the door slammed shut, echoing in the narrow hallway like a warning. The sound was so sudden, so forceful, that it sent a jolt of fear through him. He spun around his eyes, scanning the room, but it was empty. The desk, the papers, everything in the room remained undisturbed as if nothing had happened. But the air felt thick, charged with tension. Echo's growl was deep and guttural, a sound he hadn't heard from her in years. The dog was on high alert, her body tense, every muscle coiled, as she stared intently at the closed door. Mason's breath caught in his throat. There was something else in the house now. Something beyond the walls, something that had been waiting, watching. He felt the weight of the mansion's secrets pressing down on him. The letter in his hand felt heavier, its cryptic warning echoing in his mind. The journey is not yet over. Beware of what you uncover next. It wasn't just a warning, it was a call to action. But what was it that he was meant to uncover? And who or what was behind those footsteps that had followed him? His hands shook as he stuffed the letter back into his jacket pocket, his fingers still gripping the old journal. It was all starting to unravel, each discovery opening a new door, but with it, a deeper darkness. There was no turning back now. The journal, the hidden room, the footsteps, they were all connected, tied to a history that had been buried for too long. Echo barked again, this time louder, sharper. Mason turned toward the dog, his heart racing. Whatever was happening, Echo could feel it too. Her instincts were far sharper than his. But what could they do? He wasn't sure, but they had come this far. They couldn't leave without understanding the truth. Mason moved cautiously toward the door, the heavy feeling of dread hanging over him. The silence was suffocating, now thicker than before. He reached for the doorknob, his fingers cold against the metal. Just as his hand closed around it, there was a loud crash from upstairs. A sound so forceful that it shook the floor beneath him. It sounded like something heavy had been knocked over. Mason's breath caught. He had heard that sound before, something falling, something breaking. And this time, it was too close. Echo, he whispered, but the dog was already moving, darting toward the stairs. Without hesitation, Mason followed her every step, heavy with the weight of the unknown. The stairs creaked beneath his boots, each step bringing him closer to the source of the sound. He couldn't explain it, but he knew something had changed in the house. It was like it was alive, reacting to his presence, reacting to what he was about to uncover. At the top of the stairs, the door to the attic was wide open. The moonlight filtered through the dusty windows, casting a faint glow on the old wooden floor. The room was eerily quiet. There were no footsteps, no sound at all. But Mason's instincts told him to be careful. This wasn't just a room, it was the heart of everything where the past and present collided. Echo stepped into the room first, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Mason followed his flashlight, cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The furniture was still in its place, the dust undisturbed. Yet something was different. Something felt different. The air was heavier, thicker, with a sense of history of something that had been left behind. And then he saw it. A small wooden box tucked into the corner of the room, half hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. It wasn't there before. He was sure of it. His eyes narrowed. Whatever was in that box, it was connected to everything. The footsteps, the journal, the hidden door. He had to open it. His fingers trembled as he reached for the box, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment his hands touched the lid, the house seemed to shift, a low groan coming from deep within the walls. Mason held his breath, staring at the box in his hands. It felt like the entire mansion was holding its breath, waiting for him to unlock the final secret. With a deep exhale, Mason opened the box. Inside, there were photographs, old faded pictures of a man and a woman standing together in front of the mansion. They were smiling, their faces bright with life, and behind them the mansion seemed alive too. It looked different, less decayed, more vibrant. There was a family, a life in those pictures, a past that had been erased. Mason's fingers shook as he flipped through the photos. One of the pictures had a date written on the back, 1957, before Rossini's empire crumbled. As he turned the last photo, a small envelope fell from the stack, its corners worn with age. Inside was another letter. The handwriting was familiar, Rosini's. To the one who finds this, I leave behind the truth, my confession, and the legacy I could never share. The mansion is not just my prison, it is my redemption. It is yours now, if you are brave enough to take it. The key is in the basement behind the wall. Only you can decide what happens next. Mason stared at the letter. His pulse raced. The mansion, his inheritance, wasn't just a property. It was a secret waiting to be revealed, a story of betrayal, regret, and redemption. But what would he do with the truth once it was in his hands? Would he take Rosini's legacy and make it his own, or would he leave it buried, just like everyone else had? The choice was his. The air in the mansion felt suffocating now. Mason stood at the threshold of the room, his breath shallow, his heart thudding in his chest. The letter in his hands, the final clue, was all that was left of the secret that had been buried here for so long. A confession from Rosini himself. It was a truth too dangerous to reveal, too dark, to remain hidden for much longer. Echo Mason murmured, his voice rough. The dog stood by his side, her ears perked, her body still. She was watching him closely, as if understanding the weight of the moment. The old wooden floor creaked beneath his boots, as he took a step forward, walking toward the hidden doorway that had been the mansion's secret for so long. Behind it lay the last part of the puzzle, the basement, the wall, and the key that Rosini had hidden there. Mason swallowed hard, the taste of dust and fear in his mouth. He had no choice now. The mansion had drawn him in with its mysteries, its secrets, its promise of redemption. But he wasn't just unearthing the past, he was staring down the future. The choice was no longer just about him, it was about what kind of man he was willing to become. His fingers gripped the journal tightly. The weight of it had shifted from something mysterious to something personal. Rosini had tried to bury his sins. He had tried to leave a legacy, a redemption that had never seen the light of day. But Mason had found it. He had uncovered it all. And now the question remained, what would he do with the truth? He could feel the house breathing around him. It wasn't the wind or the creaks of the foundation settling. It was the mansion itself alive, with the weight of its past, of the guilt and the ambition that had once filled it. Mason's hand trembled as he reached for the lever hidden behind the wall. His breath caught as the stone creaked, groaning under the pressure. Slowly the hidden door began to open, revealing the dark, musty basement beyond. Echo growled softly, her body tense, and Mason took a deep breath before stepping forward. The basement was cold, colder than anything else in the mansion. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and old wood. And there, just in front of him, was the wall, the one Rosini had hidden behind. The last piece of the puzzle. Mason's heart raced as he reached for the exposed stone. The wall was covered with cracks, and the mortar was loose in places. He could almost feel Rosini's presence in the air, like a ghost lingering, watching. The walls seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for him to uncover the truth. His fingers brushed against the stones, feeling the coolness of them. The basement was eerily silent, the only sound, the thrum of his own heartbeat. Echo was behind him now, still as a statue, watching him with those knowing eyes. With a final push, Mason moved the stone aside. What lay behind it was more than he could have imagined. The room beyond was small but filled with relics of a past long forgotten. Old furniture, weathered paintings, and artifacts lined the walls. But it was the chest in the center of the room that caught Mason's attention. It was large, made of heavy wood, and bound with thick iron. His hands shook as he approached the chest, his breath shallow as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. This was it, the final secret, the thing that had been hidden for so long. Echo barked suddenly, a sharp, piercing sound that snapped Mason out of his trance. The dog had noticed something moving in the shadows. Mason stepped back, his heart racing. He wasn't alone. A figure stepped out from the corner of the room, its silhouette dark against the dim light from the basement window. It was a man tall and thin, with an air of quiet authority. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he had been waiting there for Mason all along. "Who are you?" Mason's voice was low, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight in his pocket. But the figure didn't move toward him. Instead, he stayed still, watching him carefully. "I could ask you the same thing," the man replied, his voice calm, but carrying an edge of something darker. Mason's blood ran cold. The figure's voice was familiar, like a whisper from the past. It was as though this man had been waiting for Mason to come here, for the moment of truth to arrive. The man stepped forward, closer to the chest. "Rosini's secrets were never meant for your eyes," he said softly. "And now you've uncovered them, but you don't know what you're dealing with." "Do you?" Mason took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" The man smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was a smile that spoke of years of hidden plans, of manipulation, and of power. He walked closer to the chest, but his eyes never left Mason's face. "What I want," the man said, "is to make sure Rosini's legacy stays buried. And that includes you." Mason's blood ran colder as the man stepped closer, and for the first time he realized that what he had stumbled upon in this mansion was not just a hidden treasure. It was a war that had been waged long before he ever set foot in this house. The chest was just the beginning. The secrets it contained were far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Mason's heart hammered in his chest as the man's cold smile twisted. "You don't get to decide, Hale. The house has already chosen you." The words felt like a weight pushing him back. The man's eyes burned with a fire that seemed to come from another time, another place, a time when the mansion had been full of power and secrets. But Mason couldn't back down now. The past had caught up with him, but he wasn't going to let it control his future. "I'm not here to carry anyone's legacy," Mason said, his voice steady, despite the storm brewing inside him. "I'm here to make sure this ends." The man's smile faltered, replaced with something darker. "You're fooling yourself if you think you can just walk away from it. The mansion, the legacy, Rosini, it's all in your blood now. You can't escape what you are." "I'm not Rosini," Mason shot back, his pulse quickening. "And I won't become him. Whatever this house wants, whatever secrets it's been hiding, I won't be the one to continue this damn cycle." The man's gaze hardened. "Then you've made your choice. But know this, some things can't be erased, not even by you." Mason didn't flinch. He couldn't. The anger inside him was building, but it was mixed with something else, something colder. Fear, but not for himself. Fear for what would happen if he walked away, leaving the house to keep its secrets. He couldn't allow that. "I don't need to carry anyone's sins," Mason said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'm not here to fix Rosini's mistakes. I'm here to end them." With those words, a shift seemed to happen in the air. It was as if the house itself, every corner, every room, took a deep breath, as if the weight of Mason's decision had just been acknowledged. The man stood still, his eyes narrowing, as if considering his next move. But Mason had already made up his mind. He didn't need anyone's approval. He didn't need the mansion's legacy to define him. Echo's low growl broke the silence, her body tense as she stared at the man, her eyes locked on him with unwavering focus. The dog had been Mason's silent protector, but now she was the last line of defense. Mason took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the man. "I've come this far, and I won't let you stop me." The man's lips curled into a sneer. "You think you've won. This house will never let you leave. It will follow you. The past is always here in the walls, in the foundation. You can't outrun it." "I'm not trying to outrun anything," Mason said, his voice hardening. "I'm facing it." With a final glare, the man turned, retreating back into the shadows of the basement. Mason watched him go, his mind spinning. For a moment, he felt the weight of the house's history pressing against him again. But this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a choice. He had the power to move forward. He had the power to change what this house represented. Mason took a deep breath, his hand still gripping the journal. The chest sat just a few feet away, its contents still a mystery. But it wasn't about the chest anymore. It wasn't about the treasure or the secrets hidden in the walls. It was about him, what he would do next. Echo padded quietly beside him, her presence steady, reassuring. She had always been by his side through the worst of it all. And now more than ever, he knew he wasn't alone. Mason turned away from the basement, the sound of Echo's pause echoing behind him. There was still work to do, still truths to face. But the mansion, the legacy, it no longer had a hold on him. He had faced it. He had made his decision. And that he realized was the only thing that truly mattered. The days that followed were quiet, unnervingly so. The mansion, which had once pulsed with the weight of its secrets, now seemed to exhale in relief. The walls, once thick with the memories of betrayal and regret, had softened. It was as though the house itself understood the decision Mason had made, and in some strange way it accepted it. Mason walked through the rooms, his footsteps muted on the worn floors. Echo walked beside him, her steps steady, her gaze still sharp but more at peace. The air was lighter now, and the weight of the mansion no longer seemed to press against his chest. He had come to the house searching for answers, but what he had found was something deeper, a truth that had nothing to do with the mansion's dark past and everything to do with his own future. He didn't need to carry the weight of Rosini's empire. He didn't need to follow a legacy that wasn't his own. What mattered now was what he would build, what he would create from the ashes of the past. The sunlight, which had once been filtered through thick curtains of dust and decay, now streamed freely through the tall windows. The rooms, once dim and trapped in time, felt alive again, filled with warmth and possibility. The mansion was not the prison it had once been, it had become a place of choice, a place of renewal. As Mason walked into the grand hall, his eyes were drawn to the fireplace. The flames crackled, casting dancing shadows across the room, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt at ease. This house had been full of ghosts, of past mistakes, of people who had never had the chance to redeem themselves. But he wasn't like them. He had chosen to face his past, to let it go, and to move forward. Echo lay down near the fire, her body relaxed, her eyes half closed as she rested. Mason smiled softly, his heart warmed by the simple, quiet moment. He could hear the faint rustle of the wind outside, the soft sighs of the house settling into its new rhythm. The mansion had found its peace, and so had he. Outside, the garden was beginning to bloom again. The weeds that had once overtaken the courtyard were being replaced by flowers and greenery, the transformation as visible as his own. Mason stood at the window, gazing out at the garden, watching the first of the spring blooms push through the earth, eager to greet the Sunday. He thought of everything that had happened. The secrets, the confrontations, the decisions he had been forced to make. In the end, it wasn't the chest or the hidden documents that had mattered. It was the choice he had made to stop running, to stop being defined by the past. He had chosen to build something new, something that could stand on its own without the weight of corruption hanging over it. He turned back to the mansion, to the life he had begun to rebuild. This house, which had once been a symbol of greed and violence, was now his place of healing, his sanctuary. But it wasn't just for him. It was for the future, for the generations that would follow, for the people who needed a place to find redemption. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and now Mason was ready to leave behind the shadows of his past and step into the light. As he stood in the center of the grand hall, the sunlight streaming through the windows, he looked down at Echo, who was now resting peacefully. She had always been his constant, his partner in this journey, and now she too had found her place in this new beginning. For a long time, Mason had believed he was running from something, from his past, from the mistakes he had made. But now he realized he wasn't running anymore. He had come full circle. He had faced the ghosts of the mansion, the ghosts of his own life, and he had come out stronger, ready to face whatever came next. In the distance, the wind picked up again, rustling the leaves outside. The soft sound was like a whisper of approval, a promise that this house, this new beginning, was ready. Mason took a deep breath and smiled. The past could no longer haunt him. The mansion had been given its freedom, and so had he.